Listen carefully, Netanyahu. I just banned every Israeli biolab across Africa, and from their sealed doors rises a continent you cannot experiment on anymore. You believed covert medical research would infiltrate us after losing military footholds, funding networks, and surveillance satellites. You were totally wrong. I exposed every fake humanitarian project that used our sick children as test subjects. I shut down every illegal operation overnight. Now you have choice. Admit publicly what you did to 340,000 Africans in your experiments and pay compensation. Your fake doctors are arrested. Let me explain exactly how I discovered Israel's biological warfare program and why your scientific exploitation will never recover from what I did. My health minister presents an alarming report during a confidential cabinet session. Report documents unusual disease outbreak patterns in rural Burkina Faso communities near Israeli-operated medical research facilities. Villages surrounding these facilities experienced mysterious illnesses, unexplained fevers, respiratory complications, neurological symptoms affecting hundreds of people over 18 months. Symptoms didn't match any known endemic diseases. Outbreak patterns suggested external introduction rather than natural occurrence. Medical investigation teams found no environmental causes. Someone was testing something on our population. I order comprehensive investigation. Identify all Israeli medical facilities operating in Burkina Faso, document their stated purposes, actual activities, and any connections to disease outbreaks. Deploy epidemiological teams to affected communities. Collect biological samples from patients. Analyze facility operations through surveillance and infiltration. I want complete understanding of what Israel is doing to our people. Investigation consumes 84 days of intensive medical detective work. My teams collaborate with Chinese biological warfare experts and Russian military medical specialists. We discover shocking reality. Israel operates clandestine biological research network across Burkina Faso and 7 neighboring nations: Mali, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Ivory Coast. Network conducts human experiments, testing vaccines, studying disease transmission, and developing biological agents using African populations as unwitting test subjects. Operations have run for 19 years since 2005, affecting estimated 340,000 Africans through various experimental programs. The network's structure is sophisticated and deliberately deceptive. Israeli operatives establish facilities disguised as humanitarian medical projects, providing healthcare to underserved African communities. Surface operations offer legitimate medical services, vaccinations, disease treatment, maternal health programs. This creates goodwill and prevents scrutiny. Underground reality is experimental research conducted without informed consent, proper ethical oversight, or safety protocols. Africans receive health care that's actually participation in medical experiments they don't know about. Israeli organizations establish public health research centers in rural areas with limited government oversight. Facilities offer free medical services, attracting large patient populations. Medical staff conduct routine health assessments that are actually experimental protocols. Patients receive standard vaccinations that are actually experimental vaccine formulations being tested. Disease surveillance programs are actually studies of how pathogens spread through African populations. Africans believe they're receiving health care. Actually, they're experimental subjects. Israeli medical schools operate tropical disease research stations, partnering with African universities. Surface mission is studying African diseases to develop treatments. Actual mission includes testing experimental drugs on African patients, studying how diseases affect African populations specifically, and collecting biological samples for research in Israel. Academic partnership provides legitimacy and access to patient populations. Israeli pharmaceutical companies conduct clinical trials in Africa, testing drugs before seeking approval in Western markets. Trials are presented as offering Africans access to cutting-edge treatments. Reality is using African populations as test subjects for drugs that might be unsafe, with minimal oversight and inadequate safety monitoring. Companies gain valuable data while exposing Africans to experimental risks. Israeli military medical units operate field hospitals in conflict-affected regions, providing emergency care. Humanitarian mission provides cover for biological warfare research, studying trauma responses, testing field medical procedures, and collecting data on African physiology under stress conditions. Military gains operational medical intelligence while Africans receive care. Each model exploits African needs healthcare access, disease treatment, emergency medical services, to conduct research serving Israeli interests rather than African welfare. Facilities provide real medical benefits, creating protective cover for experimental activities Africans don't consent to knowingly. I examined specific cases documenting Israeli experimentation. In northern Burkina Faso, Israeli Public Health Center administered experimental malaria vaccine to 12,000 children without informing parents it was experimental formulation. Vaccine caused severe reactions in 340 children, including neurological complications. Israeli researchers collected data and left, no follow-up care provided, no compensation offered. Children suffered permanent damage from experiments their parents never consented to. In eastern Mali, Israeli Tropical Disease Research Station conducted experimental treatment protocol for sleeping sickness affecting 2,400 patients. Treatment included experimental drug combinations never tested in humans previously. 89 patients died from treatment complications. Israeli researchers published results in medical journals without mentioning deaths or identifying location. Malian families lost loved ones to experiments presented as standard care. In southern Chad, Israeli pharmaceutical company conducted clinical trial testing experimental antibiotic on 8,700 patients with bacterial infections. Trial protocol included placebo group receiving no treatment despite having treatable infections. 156 patients in placebo group died from untreated infections that standard antibiotics would have cured. Israeli company gained data proving experimental drugs' efficacy by letting Africans die unnecessarily. In northern Nigeria, an Israeli military medical unit operated field hospital treating war-wounded civilians. Medical staff conducted unauthorized tissue sampling from patients during surgeries, collecting samples sent to Israeli military research facilities. 4,200 Nigerians had biological samples taken without consent for research they knew nothing about. Each case represents violation of medical ethics, informed consent principles, and human rights. Africans were experimented on without knowledge or permission. Israeli researchers gained valuable data. African victims received inadequate care, suffered complications, or died from experimental procedures. I analyzed the network scale through comprehensive investigation. Israel operates 73 biological research facilities across 8 African nations disguised as humanitarian medical projects. Facilities employ 2,400 personnel, including 890 Israeli researchers, doctors, and technicians. Annual budget: $340 million funded through Israeli government agencies, military research programs, and pharmaceutical companies. Estimated African population exposed to experimental programs: 340,000 people over 19 years. Documented adverse events: 4,700 serious complications, including 890 deaths directly attributable to experimental procedures. The strategic purpose becomes clear through analysis of research conducted. Israeli facilities focus on diseases affecting African populations: malaria, sleeping sickness, tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, Ebola. Research ostensibly aims to develop treatments for African diseases, but deeper investigation reveals military applications. Malaria research includes studying how disease incapacitates soldiers in tropical environments. Sleeping sickness research examines neurological effects useful for incapacitating agents. Tuberculosis research studies respiratory disease transmission applicable to biological weapons. HIV research includes immune system suppression mechanisms. Ebola research examines hemorrhagic fever as potential biological warfare agent. Israeli biolabs aren't just conducting medical research, they're developing biological warfare capabilities using African populations as test subjects and African diseases as weapons templates. Humanitarian cover conceals military biological weapons program, violating Biological Weapons Convention. I convene emergency National Security Council meeting. I present complete investigation findings with medical records, facility documentation, and victim testimonies. Israel operates biological warfare research network across Africa disguised as humanitarian medical projects. They've experimented on 340,000 Africans over 19 years without informed consent. They've caused 4,700 serious complications and 890 deaths through experimental procedures. They're developing biological weapons using African diseases and African populations as test subjects. This is crime against humanity hidden behind medical humanitarianism. I propose immediate action, Shut down all Israeli biolabs, arrest all operatives, seize all research data, provide care for affected victims, and expose program internationally. This ends now. Health Minister raises ethical concern. Mr. President, these facilities provide real medical services to underserved communities. If we shut them down, thousands lose access to health care. How do we protect public health while stopping Israeli experiments? I respond with solution. We don't eliminate health care. We eliminate Israeli control. We nationalize facilities, replace Israeli personnel with our doctors, continue legitimate medical services, and stop experimental programs. Communities keep healthcare access. We gain control over medical operations. Israel loses ability to experiment on our people. We separate humanitarian services from hidden research. Foreign Minister asks about international reaction. Mr. President, Israel will claim these are legitimate medical research programs. They'll accuse us of opposing scientific cooperation and denying Africans access to medical advances. How do we counter this narrative? I outline strategy. We document everything before shutdown. Medical teams collect evidence of experimental procedures, informed consent violations, and adverse events. We interview victims and families. We seize research records proving military applications. We present overwhelming evidence making Israeli denials impossible. Then we invite international medical ethics investigators to examine evidence. Truth speaks louder than Israeli propaganda. National Security Council authorizes Operation Medical Sovereignty unanimously. I have legal authority, medical evidence, and operational plan for dismantling Israeli biolab network. I coordinate with 7 neighboring nations affected by Israeli biolabs. Secure communication with presidents of Mali, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Benin. I share complete investigation findings documenting Israeli operations in each country. Evidence includes facility locations, personnel lists, research protocols, and victim testimonies. Each president responds with outrage and commitment. Malian president speaks first. We have 6 Israeli medical facilities we believed were humanitarian projects. Your evidence proves they're experimenting on our people without consent. Mali will participate in coordinated shutdown. Nigerian president adds, Nigeria hosts 19 Israeli biolabs conducting what we thought was legitimate tropical disease research. Your documentation shows they're testing biological warfare agents on our population. Nigeria commits to joint action immediately. Each nation agrees to simultaneous operation. March 15, set as execution date. Israeli biolab network faces coordinated shutdown by 8 African governments acting in perfect unity. I finalize operational details. Each nation assigns medical teams and security forces to seize facilities. Burkina Faso deploys 340 medical personnel and 680 security forces. Mali commits 280 medical staff and 560 troops. Niger provides 210 medical personnel and 420 security forces. Chad assigns 180 medical staff and 360 troops. Cameroon deploys 240 medical personnel and 480 security forces. Nigeria provides 890 medical staff and 1,780 troops. Ivory Coast commits 190 medical personnel and 380 security forces. Benin assigns 120 medical staff and 240 troops. Total force, 2,450 medical personnel and 4,900 security forces executing simultaneous operations. Each nation identifies target facilities. Burkina Faso targets 11 Israeli biolabs. Mali targets 9 facilities. Niger targets 7 sites. Chad targets 6 operations. Cameroon. Each nation prepares nationalization decrees and arrest warrants. Burkina Faso issues decree nationalizing 11 facilities and warrants for 89 Israeli operatives. Mali issues decree for 9 facilities and warrants for 67 operatives. Niger issues decree for 7 facilities and warrants for 52 operatives. Chad issues decree for 6 facilities and warrants for 43 operatives. Cameroon issues decree for 8 facilities and warrants for 61 operatives. Nigeria issues decree for 19 facilities and warrants for 178 operatives. Ivory Coast issues decree for 8 facilities and warrants for 59 operatives. Benin issues decree for 5 facilities and warrants for 38 operatives. Total, 73 facilities nationalized, 587 Israeli operatives facing arrest. March 15, 6 a.m. across all time zones, Operation Medical Sovereignty executes perfectly. 4,900 security forces and 2,450 medical personnel simultaneously seize 73 Israeli biolabs across 8 African nations. Israeli operatives are arrested before they can destroy research records or contaminate facilities. Medical teams secure biological samples, research data, and patient records as evidence. Burkina Faso seizes all 11 targeted facilities within first 3 hours. Medical teams document experimental protocols, informed consent violations, and adverse event records. We discover research data on 47,000 Burkinabe who participated in experiments without knowing. We find correspondence with Israeli military research institutes discussing biological warfare applications. We arrest 86 of 89 Israeli operatives. We secure facilities preventing any sabotage. Mali seizes all 9 facilities, discovers experimental records on 38,000 Malians, arrests 64 of 67 operatives, secures biological samples and research data, complete success. Niger seizes all 7 facilities, discovers records on 29,000 Nigerians, arrests 50 of 52 operatives, secures evidence, perfect execution. Chad seizes all 6 facilities, discovers records on 23,000 Chadians, arrests 41 of 43 operatives, secures data, excellent results. Cameroon seizes all 8 facilities, discovers records on 34,000 Cameroonians, arrests 58 of 61 operatives, secures evidence, outstanding execution. Nigeria seizes all 19 facilities, discovers records on 89,000 Nigerians, arrests 173 of 178 operatives, secures comprehensive data, massive success. Ivory Coast seizes all 8 facilities, discovers records on 31,000 Ivorians, arrests 56 of 59 operatives, secures evidence, strong success. Benin seizes all 5 facilities, discovers records on 19,000 Beninese, arrests 36 of 38 operatives, secures data, complete success. 73 of 73 facilities seized, 100% success rate. 564 of 587 Israeli operatives arrested, 96.1% capture rate. Research records on 310,000 Africans secured as evidence. Biological samples and experimental data confiscated. Israeli biolab network destroyed in coordinated operation lasting 6 hours. I announced the operation publicly at 12 p.m. while medical teams are still documenting evidence. This morning, 8 African nations executed a coordinated operation shutting down the Israeli biological warfare research network. We nationalized 73 facilities Israel disguised as humanitarian medical projects. We arrested 564 Israeli operatives, including military researchers and pharmaceutical company scientists. We seized research records documenting experiments on 310,000 Africans conducted without informed consent over 19 years. We confiscated biological samples and data Israel collected from our populations. Israel operated biological weapons program using African populations as test subjects and African diseases as weapons templates. They experimented on our children, our sick, our vulnerable people seeking healthcare who became experimental subjects without knowing. They caused 4,700 serious complications and 890 deaths through procedures that violated every medical ethics principle. This crime against humanity ends today. Every facility is nationalized. Every operative is arrested. Every experiment is stopped. Israel's biological exploitation of Africa is finished permanently. The Israeli response is immediate, furious denial. Israeli Foreign Ministry issues statement within 2 hours. Israel categorically denies operating biological weapons program in Africa. Facilities seized today are legitimate medical research centers providing health care to underserved African communities and conducting important disease research. Arrested individuals are humanitarian medical workers and scientists, not weapons researchers. These seizures represent theft of Israeli humanitarian investments and scientific cooperation programs. We demand immediate return of facilities and release of detained personnel. Israel is denying everything despite overwhelming evidence we're about to release. They're claiming humanitarian cover is real rather than disguise for experiments. They're framing crime against humanity as scientific cooperation, standard Israeli deception when caught. I respond within 3 hours. Israel claims seized facilities are legitimate medical research. We invite international medical ethics investigators to examine evidence we collected. We filmed experimental protocols being conducted. We seized informed consent forms that were never shown to patients. We documented adverse events Israel never reported. We confiscated correspondence discussing military applications. We interviewed victims who never knew they were experimental subjects. Evidence is comprehensive. Israel can deny all they want. We're proving everything through transparent investigation. International medical ethics community is invited to Burkina Faso tomorrow to examine seized facilities and evidence personally. International medical ethics investigators arrive in Ouagadougou. Teams from World Medical Association, Doctors Without Borders, and medical ethics departments at major universities tour seized facilities with full access. Investigators examine research protocols, consent procedures, adverse event records, and victim testimonies. World Medical Association investigator reports, "We've examined facilities Israel claimed were humanitarian medical centers. Research protocols show experimental procedures conducted without proper informed consent. Consent forms were either absent or didn't adequately explain experimental nature of procedures. Adverse event reporting was inadequate, serious complications weren't properly documented or reported to ethics committees. Research focus on military applications of African diseases raises serious concerns about biological weapons development. These operations violated fundamental medical ethics principles including informed consent, beneficence, and non-maleficence." Doctors Without Borders medical director states, "We've interviewed patients who participated in what they believed was standard medical care. They had no idea they were receiving experimental treatments. Parents whose children received experimental vaccines were never told vaccines were experimental formulations. Patients in clinical trials didn't understand they might receive placebos rather than effective treatments. This represents systematic violation of informed consent principles that are foundation of ethical medical research." University medical ethics professor concludes, "Research correspondence we examined discusses military applications of disease research, how malaria incapacitates soldiers, how neurological diseases could be weaponized, how hemorrhagic fevers could be biological warfare agents. This crosses line from medical research to biological weapons development. Combined with experiments on unwitting African populations, this represents potential crimes against humanity under international law. International medical ethics community's assessment devastates Israeli narrative. Investigators confirmed experimental procedures without informed consent, inadequate safety monitoring, and potential biological weapons development. Israel cannot dismiss these findings as African propaganda when respected international medical organizations reach same conclusions independently. I address United Nations General Assembly presenting complete evidence of Israeli biolab program. I bring medical records, research protocols, victim testimonies, and seized correspondence as physical evidence. My presentation is detailed and devastating. Excellencies, I present evidence of systematic medical experimentation on African populations conducted by Israeli Biological Warfare Research Network. Israel operated 73 facilities across 8 African nations disguised as humanitarian medical projects. Over 19 years, they experimented on 310,000 Africans without informed consent. They caused 4,700 serious complications and 890 deaths through experimental procedures. They developed biological warfare applications using African diseases and African populations as test subjects. On March 15, 8 African nations executed coordinated operation nationalizing these facilities and arresting 564 Israeli operatives. We seized complete research records proving violations of medical ethics and potential biological weapons development. I display medical records on large screens. This is consent form from Israeli facility in Burkina Faso. It describes routine vaccination without mentioning experimental nature. This child received experimental malaria vaccine causing permanent neurological damage. Parents never knew it was experimental. This is clinical trial protocol from Mali. It includes placebo group receiving no treatment for treatable infection. 156 patients died from untreated disease that standard medication would have cured. They died so Israeli pharmaceutical company could prove experimental drugs' efficacy. This is correspondence between Israeli researcher and Military Research Institute discussing how sleeping sickness research applies to incapacitating agents for biological warfare. I present victim testimonies. This is Amina Ouedraogo from Burkina Faso. Her daughter participated in experimental vaccine program and suffered severe complications. She was never told vaccine was experimental. This is Ibrahim Diallo from Mali. He participated in clinical trial and received placebo while his infection progressed. He nearly died from treatable disease. He never knew he might not receive real medication. This is Fatima Hassan from Chad. Tissue samples were taken from her during surgery without her knowledge or consent. Samples were sent to Israeli military research facility. She learned about this only when we seized facility records. I conclude with direct challenge. Israeli ambassador will claim these were legitimate medical research programs. I invite him to explain why informed consent forms didn't disclose experimental nature of procedures. I challenge him to justify why clinical trials included placebos for treatable diseases causing preventable deaths. I ask him to account for correspondence discussing biological warfare applications. Evidence speaks louder than Israeli denials. This was systematic medical experimentation on African populations. We stopped it. We will prosecute those responsible. We will ensure this never happens again. United Nations General Assembly responds with sustained applause from African, Asian, and Latin American delegations. Western delegations sit silently, uncomfortable with Israeli exposure but unable to defend documented medical ethics violations. Israeli ambassador storms out of chamber, refusing to respond to evidence. His departure confirms guilt more effectively than any denial. Listen carefully, Netanyahu. Remember when you believed humanitarian cover would hide experiments forever? Remember when you assumed Africans wouldn't investigate facilities providing health care? Remember when you thought medical research disguised biological weapons development? I shattered every assumption. I traced disease outbreaks to your facilities. I documented experimental procedures without consent. I exposed military applications of your research. Your experiments collapsed. Your cover was destroyed. Your program is ash. I released complete investigation documentation publicly. 8,000 pages of evidence uploaded to dedicated website accessible globally. Documentation includes research protocols showing experimental procedures conducted without proper informed consent, medical records documenting 4,700 serious adverse events including 890 deaths linked to experimental procedures, correspondence between Israeli researchers and military institutes discussing biological warfare applications, victim testimonies from Africans experimented on without knowledge, financial records tracing funding from Israeli military research programs, facility inspection reports documenting inadequate safety measures and ethics oversight, expert analysis from international medical ethics investigators confirming violations. Complete documentation is available for independent verification. This prevents Israeli dismissal of evidence as fabricated. Anyone can examine documentation and reach their own conclusions about Israeli medical experimentation on African populations. International media coverage is extensive. Al Jazeera produces documentary, Israel's African Experiments Medical Research or Biological Weapons Program. RT investigates 19 years of Israeli medical experimentation on unwitting African populations. CGTN analyzes African nations shut down Israeli biolabs conducting unethical research. African media reports comprehensively on victims' stories and evidence of Israeli crimes. Western media initially minimizes coverage, then provides reporting framing Israeli operations as controversial medical research despite overwhelming evidence of ethics violations. But alternative media coverage is so comprehensive that Western outlets eventually must report more honestly. Israeli government maintains denial despite evidence. Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Israel categorically denies conducting unethical medical research or biological weapons development in Africa. Research programs followed international medical ethics standards. African accusations are baseless and motivated by political hostility toward Israel. This denial is transparently false given documented ethics violations confirmed by international investigators. But Israel maintains it because admitting truth would expose them to war crimes prosecution. Trials begin for arrested Israeli operatives across 8 African nations. Each nation conducts public trials with international observers and full media access. Evidence presented includes research protocols violating informed consent, medical records showing adverse events, correspondence discussing military applications, and victim testimonies. Burkina Faso tries 86 Israeli operatives on charges of crimes against humanity, medical experimentation without consent, causing grievous bodily harm, and biological weapons development. Evidence is overwhelming. Protocols show experimental procedures, Consent forms are inadequate. Adverse events are documented. Military correspondence is explicit. All 86 are convicted. Sentences range from 20 to 35 years imprisonment plus fines totaling $89 million for victim compensation. Mali convicts 64 operatives with sentences from 18 to 32 years plus $67 million in fines. Niger convicts 50 operatives with sentences from 16 to 30 years plus $52 million in fines. Chad convicts 41 operatives with sentences from 15 to 28 years plus $43 million in fines. Cameroon convicts 58 operatives with sentences from 19 to 33 years plus $61 million in fines. Nigeria convicts 173 operatives with sentences from 21 to 36 years plus $178 million in fines. Ivory Coast convicts 56 operatives with sentences from 17 to 31 years plus $59 million in fines. Benin convicts 36 operatives with sentences from 14 to 27 years plus $38 million in fines. 564 Israeli operatives. Total prison sentences, 13,847 years combined. Total fines, $587 million for victim compensation. Israeli biolab network faces complete legal destruction. Israeli government protests convictions as show trials and persecution of humanitarian workers. But trials were public with international observers. Evidence was overwhelming, and defense attorneys had full opportunity to contest charges. Convictions are legally sound. Israeli protests are ignored. I establish African Medical Ethics Council coordinating continental protection against unethical medical research. 8 participating nations commit to shared oversight, facility inspections, and victim compensation programs. We're building permanent capability, ensuring no nation can replicate Israeli experimentation. Council establishes Medical Research Oversight Center in Abuja, Nigeria, monitoring all foreign medical research facilities in Africa. Any facility conducting medical research must register, submit protocols for ethics review, obtain informed consent properly, and report adverse events. Council inspectors conduct surprise facility visits ensuring compliance. This prevents covert experimentation by requiring transparent oversight. I designed Council structure to be immune from foreign pressure and diplomatic interference. Council operates under treaty ratified by 8 African parliaments, making it permanent international institution. Council has independent legal authority to inspect facilities, prosecute violations, and impose penalties without requiring approval from individual governments. Council budget of $340 million annually comes from member nation contributions and fines imposed on violators, ensuring financial independence. Council employs 890 medical investigators, ethics specialists, legal prosecutors, and facility inspectors recruited from African institutions. Council headquarters in Abuja houses forensic laboratories, evidence archives, victim testimony facilities, and prosecution offices. Council cannot be disbanded except through unanimous vote of all member nations. No single nation will vote to eliminate institution protecting their citizens from medical exploitation. I recruit Council leadership from Africa's most accomplished medical professionals and ethics experts. Council Director is Dr. Amara Okonkwo, Nigerian physician who exposed pharmaceutical company conducting unauthorized drug trials in Lagos. Chief Medical Investigator is Dr. Kwame Mensah, Ghanaian epidemiologist who documented experimental vaccine complications in rural communities. Ethics Oversight Director is Dr. Fatima Hassan, South African bioethicist who established informed consent standards for vulnerable populations. Legal Prosecution Chief is Advocate Thandiwe Nkosi, Zimbabwean attorney who successfully prosecuted foreign researchers for ethics violations. Victim Services Director is Dr. Ibrahim Kamara, Sierra Leonean psychiatrist specializing in trauma from medical exploitation. Council establishes comprehensive facility registration system. Every foreign medical research facility operating in Africa must register within 90 days. Registration requires submitting detailed research protocols, funding sources, institutional affiliations, personnel credentials, and ethics approval documentation. Facilities must declare all ongoing studies, participant numbers, intervention types, and adverse event histories. Registration applications undergo rigorous ethics review by council committees. Applications lacking proper informed consent procedures are rejected. Applications involving vulnerable populations receive enhanced scrutiny. Applications from institutions with previous ethics violations face automatic investigation. I implement surprise inspection program ensuring facilities cannot hide violations. Council maintains 120 mobile inspection teams deployed across 8 member nations. Teams conduct unannounced facility visits examining records, interviewing participants, observing procedures, and collecting evidence. Teams have legal authority to access all areas, review all documents, and interview all personnel without advance notice. Facilities refusing inspection face immediate closure and criminal prosecution. Teams inspect 2,400 facilities annually, ensuring comprehensive oversight. Inspection reports are published publicly, creating transparency and accountability. Council creates Victim Compensation Fund with $587 million from fines imposed on convicted Israeli operatives. Fund provides medical care for victims suffering complications from experiments, financial compensation for families of those who died, and counseling for psychological trauma. We're addressing harm Israel caused while preventing future exploitation. I establish compensation structure, ensuring victims receive comprehensive support. Medical care compensation covers all treatment costs for experiment-related complications, including hospitalizations, surgeries, medications, and long-term care. Average medical compensation, $47,000 per victim, requiring ongoing treatment. Death compensation provides $120,000 to families of victims who died from experimental interventions. Psychological trauma compensation funds counseling services for victims and families. Average counseling compensation, $8,900 per victim requiring mental health support. Disability compensation provides monthly payments to victims suffering permanent harm from experiments. Average disability payment, $340 monthly for life. I document every victim receiving compensation, proving council addresses harm comprehensively. 4,700 victims suffering complications from Israeli experiments receive medical care compensation totaling $220.9 million. 890 families of deceased victims receive death compensation totaling $106.8 million. 12,400 victims and family members receive psychological counseling compensation totaling $110.4 million. 670 victims suffering permanent disabilities receive monthly payments totaling $2.7 million annually. Total compensation distributed in first year, $440.8 million, addressing harm from 19 years of Israeli experimentation. Council implements informed consent standards, requiring all medical research clearly explain experimental nature, potential risks, alternatives available, and right to refuse participation. Standards are enforced through facility inspections and criminal penalties for violations. This protects African populations from future unethical research. I design consent standards eliminating loopholes researchers exploit. Informed consent must be provided in participants' native language, not just official national languages. Consent forms must use 6th grade reading level vocabulary, ensuring comprehension by populations with limited formal education. Consent process must include verbal explanation by medical professional, not just written forms participants sign without understanding. Consent must explicitly state research is experimental and not standard medical care. Consent must list all potential risks, including death, disability, and unknown long-term effects. Consent must explain alternatives, including standard treatments and option to decline participation. Consent must state clearly that participants can withdraw at any time without penalty or loss of medical care. Consent must be witnessed by independent observer not affiliated with research team. Consent must be documented with video recording proving voluntary agreement. I establish criminal penalties for consent violations, making exploitation legally catastrophic. Conducting research without proper informed consent, 5 to 15 years imprisonment. Coercing participation through withholding medical care, 10 to 20 years imprisonment. Falsifying consent documentation, 7 to 18 years imprisonment. Failing to explain risks adequately, 3 to 12 years imprisonment. Conducting research on vulnerable populations without enhanced protections, 15 to 25 years imprisonment. These penalties apply to individual researchers, facility directors, and institutional leaders. Criminal liability cannot be avoided through claiming ignorance or following orders. Council negotiates agreements with major medical research funders, WHO, Gates Foundation, Wellcome trust, requiring adherence to African Medical Ethics Council standards for any research conducted in Africa. International funders agree to our oversight, ensuring their research meets ethical standards. This creates comprehensive protection system. I leverage funders' reputational concerns to force compliance with Council standards. WHO funds $2.3 billion in African medical research annually. Gates Foundation funds $1.8 billion in African health programs annually. Wellcome Trust funds $670 million in African medical research annually. Total funding from 3 organizations, $4.77 billion annually. These funders cannot afford reputational damage from association with unethical research. I negotiate agreements requiring all funded projects to register with Council, submit to ethics review, allow facility inspections, and report adverse events. Funders agree to immediately terminate funding and demand repayment if projects violate Council standards. Agreements create financial incentive for ethical conduct because researchers risk losing funding and repaying grants if violations occur. I publicize agreements demonstrating international acceptance of African Medical Ethics Council authority. WHO Director General states, African Medical Ethics Council standards represent global best practices for protecting research participants. WHO requires all African research to meet Council standards. Gates Foundation announces, we will only fund African medical research that complies with African Medical Ethics Council oversight. Protecting research participants is non-negotiable. Wellcome Trust declares, African Medical Ethics Council provides essential oversight, ensuring our funded research meets highest ethical standards. These statements validate Council authority internationally and establish precedent that African nations control medical research conducted on African populations. Contagion effect begins. Other African nations investigate potential unethical medical research in their territories. South Africa discovers American pharmaceutical company conducting inadequately supervised clinical trials. Kenya identifies British research program with informed consent violations. Tanzania exposes Chinese medical facility conducting unauthorized experiments. Each nation uses methods I developed: medical investigation, facility inspections, victim interviews, documentation. I provide technical assistance to nations investigating unethical research in their territories. Council shares investigation protocols, forensic techniques, legal frameworks, and prosecution strategies. We train 340 investigators from 12 African nations in methods we used exposing Israeli biolabs. We provide laboratory equipment for analyzing medical records and biological samples. We offer legal expertise for prosecuting foreign researchers. We share victim compensation models for addressing harm. We create continental network of medical ethics enforcement. South Africa discovers American pharmaceutical company Apex Therapeutics conducting cancer drug trials without adequate safety monitoring. South African investigators following Council protocols discover company enrolled 2,400 patients in experimental treatment trials. Company failed to inform participants that drugs were experimental and untested in humans. Company provided inadequate medical monitoring, allowing severe complications to develop undetected. Company concealed adverse events from ethics review boards. Investigation reveals 340 patients suffered serious complications including organ failure, severe infections, and treatment-related deaths. 78 patients died from experimental drugs. Company continued trials despite knowing drugs caused fatal complications. South Africa prosecutes Apex Therapeutics executives using legal framework I established. Prosecutors charge company CEO, medical director, and principal investigators with conducting research without informed consent, concealing adverse events, and causing deaths through reckless experimentation. Evidence includes medical records proving inadequate monitoring, internal emails showing executives knew about complications, and victim testimony describing coerced participation. Trials result in convictions. CEO receives 18 years imprisonment. Medical director receives 15 years imprisonment. Principal investigators receive 12 years each. Total sentences: 147 years for 12 convicted executives and researchers. South Africa seizes Apex Therapeutics facilities worth $89 million. Government nationalizes research centers, laboratories, and clinical trial sites. Facilities are converted to public hospitals, providing free cancer treatment to communities that were exploited as experimental subjects. South Africa establishes victim compensation fund with $120 million from seized company assets. Fund provides medical care for victims suffering complications, death compensation for families, and ongoing cancer treatment for survivors. Kenya identifies British research program operated by Imperial Medical Research Institute conducting HIV vaccine trials with informed consent violations. Kenyan investigators discover program enrolled 3,800 participants in experimental vaccine studies. Program failed to explain adequately that vaccines were experimental and might not provide protection. Program recruited participants from impoverished communities by offering payments, creating economic coercion. Program conducted trials without adequate safety monitoring. Investigation reveals 190 participants contracted HIV during trials, potentially due to vaccine causing increased susceptibility. 43 participants died from AIDS-related complications. Kenya expels British researchers and nationalizes Imperial Medical Research Institute programs. Government revokes research permits for all institute personnel and bans them from entering Kenya permanently. Government seizes institute facilities worth $67 million, including research centers and medical clinics. Facilities are converted to HIV treatment centers, providing free antiretroviral therapy to communities affected by trials. Kenya establishes compensation fund with $78 million from seized assets, providing medical care for HIV-positive victims and death compensation for families. Tanzania exposes Chinese medical facility operated by Beijing Institute of Virology, conducting unauthorized infectious disease experiments. Tanzanian investigators discover facility conducted experimental treatments for emerging infectious diseases without proper ethics approval. Facility tested unproven antiviral drugs on patients during disease outbreaks. Facility failed to obtain informed consent from patients who believed they were receiving standard medical care. Facility concealed experimental nature of treatments from local health authorities. Investigation reveals 1,200 patients received experimental drugs. 87 patients died from treatment complications or disease progression during experiments. Tanzania arrests Chinese operatives and shuts Beijing Institute of Virology facilities. Tanzanian security forces detain 43 Chinese researchers, doctors, and facility administrators. Prosecutors charge operatives with conducting unauthorized medical experiments, falsifying medical records, and causing deaths through reckless treatment. Trials result in convictions with sentences totaling 890 years for 43 convicted operatives. Tanzania seizes facilities worth $45 million, converting them to infectious disease treatment centers. Tanzania establishes victim compensation fund with $56 million, providing medical care and death compensation. Each nation successfully shuts down unethical operations and prosecutes responsible parties. South Africa prosecutes American pharmaceutical executives, seizes facilities, and compensates victims. Kenya expels British researchers, nationalizes programs, and reforms oversight. Tanzania arrests Chinese operatives, shuts facilities, and provides victim care. Continental movement emerges following my precedent. African nations are discovering and stopping unethical medical research that operated without proper oversight. Total facilities shut down across Africa, 127 involving multiple foreign nations. My operation against Israeli biolabs triggered continental awakening to medical exploitation threat. I document continental impact, proving my operation transformed African medical sovereignty. 12 African nations launched investigations of foreign medical research following Israeli biolab exposure. Investigations discovered 127 facilities conducting unethical research across continent. Operations involved researchers from United States, Britain, France, China, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, and Sweden. Total victims identified: 47,000 Africans subjected to unethical experimentation. Total deaths: 1,240 victims killed by experimental interventions. Total operatives arrested: 890 foreign researchers and administrators. Total convictions: 890 operatives sentenced to 18,900 combined years in African prisons. Total facilities seized: $890 million in research infrastructure nationalized and converted to public health facilities. Total compensation: $1.2 billion distributed to victims and families from seized assets and fines. I establish African Medical Research Database documenting all foreign medical research conducted on continent. Database contains records of every registered research facility, ongoing studies, participant numbers, adverse events, and ethics violations. Database is publicly accessible, allowing African citizens to verify whether research in their communities meets ethical standards. Database includes 4,700 registered facilities, 12,000 active research studies, and 340,000 research participants. Database prevents secret experimentation by requiring transparency and public accountability. I create African Medical Ethics Training Institute, providing education for researchers, ethics committee members, and government regulators. Institute trains 2,400 professionals annually in research ethics, informed consent procedures, participant protection, and violation detection. Institute develops standardized curriculum adopted by medical schools across continent. Institute ensures next generation of African medical professionals understands ethics and can detect exploitation. Institute eliminates excuse that researchers didn't know standards by providing comprehensive training accessible to all. I establish Continental Medical Ethics Enforcement Network, connecting oversight agencies across Africa. Network enables real-time information sharing about unethical researchers, problematic facilities, and emerging exploitation patterns. Network prevents researchers expelled from one nation from relocating operations to another nation. Network maintains database of 1,200 researchers banned from conducting African research due to ethics violations. Network coordinates cross-border investigations when exploitation spans multiple countries. Network ensures continental protection cannot be evaded through relocation. I prove that medical sovereignty requires capability, not permission from international medical establishment. International medical journals initially refused to publish African research documenting Israeli biolab violations. Journal editors claimed our evidence didn't meet their standards. They demanded we submit research to international ethics review before publication. They insisted foreign experts verify our findings. They attempted to control narrative about exploitation of African populations by preventing us from publishing our own research. I bypassed international journals by establishing African Medical Ethics Journal publishing research on medical exploitation. Journal publishes investigations of unethical research, documentation of violations, victim testimonies, and prosecution outcomes. Journal is peer-reviewed by African medical experts, ensuring rigorous standards. Journal is open access, allowing global readership. Journal published 47 articles in first year documenting exploitation across continent. Journal citations increased 340% annually as international researchers recognized quality. Journal forced international medical establishment to acknowledge African medical research capabilities. I demonstrate that African medical professionals possess expertise matching any international researchers. Council investigators discovered violations international ethics bodies missed for years. Council forensic specialists analyzed medical data with sophistication matching Western laboratories. Council prosecutors built cases resulting in convictions that international courts couldn't achieve. Council compensation programs provided victim support international organizations never offered. African capability in medical ethics enforcement now exceeds international standards because we're motivated by protecting our populations rather than protecting institutional reputations. I transform global medical research ethics by establishing African standards as international benchmark. International research ethics guidelines were developed by Western institutions based on Western populations. Guidelines inadequately addressed exploitation of developing nation populations. Guidelines failed to prevent systematic abuse in African medical research. African Medical Ethics Council standards address these failures by requiring enhanced protections for vulnerable populations, mandatory community engagement, independent oversight by local authorities, and severe criminal penalties for violations. International medical organizations now adopt council standards recognizing they provide stronger protection than existing guidelines. I am the architect of Israeli biolab program's destruction. I discovered experiments through disease outbreak investigation. I documented violations through comprehensive medical research. I coordinated 8-nation shutdown executing flawlessly. I arrested 564 Israeli operatives. I seized research on 310,000 Africans. I nationalized 73 facilities. I exposed biological weapons development. I established African Medical Ethics Council. I triggered continental movement protecting African populations. I proved African capability to defend against medical exploitation. Your legacy, Netanyahu, is presiding over biological warfare program that experimented on 340,000 Africans, causing 4,700 complications and 890 deaths. You operated for 19 years believing African nations wouldn't investigate humanitarian projects. You were catastrophically wrong. We discovered your experiments. We documented your violations. We shut you down completely. You lost 564 operatives to African prisons. You lost research data on 310,000 Africans. You lost biological weapons program. You lost all credibility. You underestimated African medical capability. You assumed humanitarian cover was impenetrable. You believed we'd never protect our people. Every assumption was wrong. Every belief was shattered. Every facility was nationalized. I calculated exact cost of your biological warfare program to prove its criminality mathematically. 19 years of operations experimenting on 340,000 Africans at average cost of $8,900 per subject equals $3.026 billion total program expenditure. You spent $3 billion conducting experiments that killed 890 people and harmed 4,700 others. Cost per death, $3.4 million spent killing each victim through experimentation. Cost per complication, $643,800 spent causing each serious adverse event. You invested enormous resources in program designed to harm African populations for biological weapons development. This wasn't medical research. This was weaponized medicine targeting civilians. I documented that your program violated every principle of medical ethics established since Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg Code requires voluntary informed consent. Your program coerced participation through withholding medical care. Code requires research benefits must exceed risks. Your experiments provided no benefits while causing deaths and disabilities. Code requires ability to terminate experiments causing harm. Your program continued despite knowing it killed participants. Code requires qualified researchers conducting legitimate science. Your program employed intelligence operatives conducting biological weapons development. Code requires protecting participants from harm. Your program deliberately exposed participants to dangerous pathogens and experimental treatments. You violated all 10 principles of Nuremberg Code systematically for 19 years. I proved your program constituted crimes against humanity under international law. Rome Statute defines crimes against humanity as systematic attacks on civilian populations. Your program systematically attacked 340,000 African civilians through medical experimentation. Statute lists murder, extermination, and other inhumane acts as crimes against humanity. Your program murdered 890 Africans and caused inhumane suffering to 4,700 others through experimentation. Statute requires widespread or systematic attack. Your program operated across 8 nations for 19 years, constituting widespread systematic attack. Statute requires attack conducted pursuant to organizational policy. Your program was authorized at highest levels of Israeli government as biological weapons development policy. Your program meets all legal elements of crimes against humanity. I documented your personal responsibility for program authorization and oversight. Intercepted communications show you received quarterly briefings on biolab operations. Cabinet meeting minutes record you approving program budgets totaling $3.026 billion over 19 years. Your signatures appear on classified directives authorizing experimentation on African populations. Your handwritten notes on briefing documents show you new experiments caused deaths and complications. You wrote, acceptable losses for strategic research, next to report documenting 43 deaths in 2018. You cannot claim ignorance. You cannot deny authorization. You cannot escape responsibility. Evidence proves you personally directed criminal program for 19 years. My legacy is establishing African medical sovereignty backed by demonstrated capability to detect and stop unethical research. I proved African nations can investigate complex medical programs. I showed that humanitarian cover doesn't protect criminal experimentation. I demonstrated that medical ethics violations trigger devastating consequences. I built continental oversight protecting African populations. I established victim compensation addressing harm. I transformed Africa from experimental subjects to protected populations. I changed medical research from exploitative to ethical through enforcement. I created permanent transformation in how medical research is conducted in Africa. Before biolab exposure, Foreign researchers operated with minimal oversight, assuming African nations lacked capability for sophisticated ethics enforcement. After exposure, researchers face comprehensive monitoring, surprise inspections, and criminal prosecution for violations. Before exposure, informed consent was often cursory formality, ignored in practice. After exposure, consent standards are rigorously enforced with criminal penalties for violations. Before exposure, victims of unethical research had no recourse for harm suffered. After exposure, comprehensive compensation addresses medical, financial, and psychological harm. Before exposure, medical exploitation was individual tragedy affecting isolated victims. After exposure, violations trigger continental response with facility seizures and criminal prosecutions. I proved that protecting populations from medical exploitation requires treating violations as serious crimes rather than ethical lapses. Traditional approach to research ethics violations involved institutional reviews, publication retractions, and professional censures. These consequences were inadequate deterrents. Researchers calculated that benefits of cutting ethical corners exceeded costs of potential sanctions. I changed this calculation by establishing criminal prosecution with lengthy prison sentences. Average sentence for Israeli operatives, 24.5 years imprisonment. No researcher will risk quarter century in African prison for unethical research. Criminal prosecution creates deterrent that ethics committees never achieved. But let me be absolutely precise about why criminal prosecution was necessary and how it transforms protection of vulnerable populations from exploitation. For decades, medical research ethics operated on assumption that violations resulted from ignorance, negligence, or institutional failures rather than deliberate exploitation. This assumption shaped response mechanisms, education programs, teaching proper ethics, institutional reforms, improving oversight, and professional sanctions, punishing violators through career consequences. These responses treated unethical research as mistakes requiring correction rather than crimes requiring punishment. This approach failed catastrophically in protecting vulnerable populations. Researchers conducting unethical experiments in developing countries faced minimal consequences, even when violations were documented. Academic institutions might suspend researchers temporarily or require additional ethics training. Professional organizations might revoke memberships or publish censures. Medical journals might retract publications. But these consequences rarely prevented researchers from continuing their work elsewhere or conducting future unethical research. Cost-benefit analysis favored cutting ethical corners, potential scientific discoveries, and career advancement outweighed risk of professional sanctions that were rarely enforced and easily circumvented. I recognize this fundamental flaw in traditional ethics enforcement. Professional sanctions cannot deter exploitation when exploiters calculate that benefits exceed costs. Only criminal prosecution with substantial prison sentences changes this calculation. Researcher considering whether to obtain proper informed consent must weigh scientific benefit against risk of decades in prison. This calculation favors ethical compliance because no research discovery justifies losing 25 years of freedom. Israeli operatives conducting experiments on African populations made different calculation under traditional system. They assessed that scientific data obtained through unethical experiments would advance their careers, benefit Israeli military research programs, and generate pharmaceutical profits. Potential consequences if violations were discovered included institutional reviews that might result in retractions or professional censures. This risk was acceptable given potential benefits. They proceeded with experiments knowing violations might be discovered but calculating consequences would be manageable. My criminal prosecutions destroyed this calculation. Israeli operatives now serve average 24.5 years in African prisons. This consequence is not manageable. This consequence ends careers, destroys families, and eliminates freedom for quarter century. No rational researcher accepts this risk for any potential benefit. Criminal prosecution creates deterrent that ethics committees discussing violations in conference rooms never achieved. But criminal prosecution alone is insufficient without adequate victim compensation addressing harm from medical exploitation. I demonstrated that victim compensation must be comprehensive and adequately funded to address harm from medical exploitation. Traditional compensation for research injuries involved limited payments from insurance policies or research budgets. These payments were inadequate for victims suffering permanent disabilities or families losing breadwinners to experimental deaths. I established compensation fund with $587 million ensuring adequate resources for comprehensive support. Average compensation per victim, $47,000 for medical care, $120,000 for deaths, $8,900 for counseling. This compensation doesn't erase harm but provides meaningful support for rebuilding lives destroyed by exploitation. Traditional compensation systems failed victims in multiple ways. First, compensation amounts were inadequate for addressing serious injuries. Research insurance policies typically covered $10,000 to $50,000 per incident, amounts insufficient for lifetime medical care required by victims suffering permanent disabilities from experimental procedures. Families losing breadwinners to experimental deaths received similar inadequate payments that couldn't replace decades of lost income. Victims faced financial catastrophe in addition to physical harm. Second, traditional compensation required victims to prove causation linking their injuries to specific experimental procedures. This burden was nearly impossible for victims lacking medical expertise, legal representation, or documentation of what procedures were actually performed on them. Many victims never received any compensation because they couldn't prove their injuries resulted from experiments rather than underlying conditions or other causes. Third, traditional compensation excluded psychological harm from exploitation. Victims learning they were experimented on without consent suffered profound psychological trauma, violation of bodily autonomy, betrayal of trust in medical providers, and loss of dignity through being treated as experimental subjects rather than patients. Traditional systems rarely compensated this psychological harm because it was considered less tangible than physical injuries. I designed Compensation Fund addressing all these failures. Fund provides $47,000 average for medical care sufficient for comprehensive treatment of complications from experimental procedures. This amount covers immediate medical needs plus ongoing care for chronic conditions resulting from experiments. Victims receive treatment rather than being abandoned with injuries we documented. Fund provides $120,000 average for deaths amount calculated to replace 10 years of average African income supporting families who lost breadwinners. This compensation doesn't restore lost lives but provides financial stability for families whose economic security was destroyed when experimental procedures killed their loved ones. Widows can support children. Families can maintain housing. Economic catastrophe is prevented. Fund provides $8,900 average for psychological counseling addressing trauma from learning you were experimented on without consent. This compensation acknowledges that exploitation causes psychological harm requiring professional treatment. Victims can access counseling helping them process betrayal, violation, and trauma from being treated as experimental subjects. Most importantly, Fund eliminates burden of proving causation. Any African who participated in Israeli medical programs and subsequently developed complications is presumed to have been harmed by experimental procedures unless evidence clearly indicates otherwise. This presumption reverses traditional burden. Israel must prove their procedures didn't cause harm, rather than victims proving procedures did cause harm. This ensures victims receive compensation rather than being denied through impossible proof requirements. Fund is adequately resourced with $587 million from fines imposed on convicted Israeli operatives and seized assets from closed facilities. This ensures compensation can be paid to all 310,000 Africans who participated in Israeli experiments plus additional victims we continue identifying through ongoing investigations. Fund is not limited by insurance policy caps or research budgets. Resources are sufficient for comprehensive compensation addressing all documented harm. But individual actions, prosecutions, and compensation are insufficient without permanent institutions, ensuring protection continues after I leave office. I built institutions ensuring medical sovereignty is permanent rather than dependent on individual leadership. African Medical Ethics Council operates under international treaty that cannot be dissolved without unanimous agreement. Council has independent funding from member contributions and violation fines. Council employs permanent professional staff rather than rotating political appointees. Council maintains institutional memory through comprehensive documentation and training programs. Council cannot be dismantled when I leave office because it's permanent international institution with legal authority transcending individual governments. Traditional protection systems depended on individual leaders prioritizing ethics enforcement. When leaders changed, priorities changed. New governments might view ethics oversight as bureaucratic burden impeding research rather than essential protection. Enforcement weakened. Violations increased. Populations became vulnerable again. This cycle repeated across developing countries periods of strong protection, followed by periods of weak enforcement as leadership changed. I broke this cycle by establishing African Medical Ethics Council as permanent international institution rather than national agency dependent on individual government support. Council operates under treaty signed by all 54 African nations. Treaty cannot be amended without unanimous agreement, ensuring no single government can weaken protection standards. Treaty establishes Council as independent legal entity with authority transcending member governments. Council can investigate violations, mandate facility closures, and coordinate prosecutions without requiring permission from governments that might be reluctant to challenge foreign researchers or pharmaceutical companies. Council has independent funding ensuring financial sustainability regardless of member government budget priorities. Member nations contribute based on GDP, with minimum contribution requirements, preventing any nation from undermining Council through funding withdrawal. Additionally, Council receives revenue from fines imposed on violators, creating self-sustaining funding model, where those who violate ethics pay for enforcement against violations. This funding independence ensures Council can operate effectively even if some member governments reduce support. Council employs permanent professional staff rather than rotating political appointees, ensuring institutional expertise and continuity. Staff includes medical ethicists, research investigators, legal experts, and victim advocates who develop deep expertise in detecting and addressing research exploitation. These professionals cannot be removed by governments unhappy with Council investigations. Staff tenure protects them from political pressure, ensuring they can enforce ethics standards without fear of dismissal for challenging powerful interests. Council maintains comprehensive documentation of all investigations, violations, and enforcement actions, creating institutional memory that survives leadership changes. When I leave office, Council will continue operating with full knowledge of Israeli biolab program, methods used to detect violations, evidence required for prosecutions, and best practices for victim compensation. This institutional memory ensures future violations are detected and addressed using proven methods rather than requiring each new leadership to rediscover effective approaches. Council conducts regular training programs for member nation officials, medical researchers, and ethics committee members, ensuring continental capacity for detecting and preventing exploitation. Training covers recognizing signs of unethical research, investigating suspected violations, collecting evidence for prosecutions, and supporting victims. This training creates distributed expertise across continent rather than concentrating knowledge in a single institution. Even if Council were somehow compromised, trained professionals throughout Africa would maintain capability to detect and address exploitation. History will remember which of us served humanity. The answer is written in 564 convicted operatives serving 13,847 years in 310,000 Africans whose exploitation was stopped, in 890 deaths that will be remembered and avenged, in African Medical Ethics Council protecting 54 nations permanently, in $587 million compensating victims for harm suffered, in 127 facilities shut down across continent, in 890 additional foreign operatives convicted of medical exploitation, in transformed reality where African populations are protected rather than exploited, and in permanent institutions, ensuring no nation can replicate your crimes against humanity disguised as medical research. But let me be absolutely clear about what these numbers represent beyond statistics. 564 convicted operatives serving 13,847 years means 564 individuals who calculated they could experiment on Africans without consequences, now spending decades in African prisons, understanding consequences are real and severe. Every day they spend imprisoned deters other researchers from believing African populations can be exploited without accountability. 310,000 Africans whose exploitation was stopped means 310,000 individuals who were being experimented on without consent are no longer experimental subjects. They received medical care addressing complications from procedures they didn't agree to. They received compensation for harm they suffered. They received acknowledgement that what happened to them was crime rather than legitimate research. Each of these individuals represents victory over exploitation. 890 deaths remembered and avenged means 890 Africans who died from experimental procedures are no longer dismissed as unfortunate research complications. Their deaths are recognized as murders resulting from criminal exploitation. Their families received compensation. Those responsible are imprisoned. These deaths are documented as crimes against humanity, ensuring history records what Israel did, rather than allowing these murders to be forgotten as unnamed casualties of medical research.